Imagine what your sales career would look like if when you talk to a customer, they told you three things. Number one, they don't need the cheapest price. Number two, they don't need to think about it. And number three, they don't need to get competitive bids. What would your career look like? Of course, it would be awesome. Well, if you follow the process I've developed in consistency selling, you will have your prospects make those three declarations as you go through your entire presentation. To explain how the process works, I've developed a simple metaphor called the sales hallway, which describes the concepts and the way we're going to go about making our presentation. Imagine you're in a hallway. At one end, you've got you and your prospects. At the other end is a door. If you can get to that final door at the end, that's where you earn the trust and you make the sale. The problem is, along the side of the hallway, there are other doors which can be used as escape routes for your prospects. You got to keep in mind, in most situations, your prospects don't like being in the sales hallway. After all, if they're in the sales hallway, it probably means they're fixing to spend money, which none of us really like to do. You also have to understand that in many cases, your prospects have had bad experience with salespeople, right? Pushy salespeople, obnoxious salespeople, so they're not always comfortable going through that process. So as you walk down the hallway, here's what's going to happen. Your prospects are going to have a ton of questions for you. Questions about you, questions about your company's guarantees, your service, all the different factors that they're going to use to make their purchasing decision. As you're walking down the hallway, the single most important piece of information they want is, of course, about the price. Now, when your prospect gets the information about the price, they want to do the most natural thing on the planet, and that is to postpone the purchasing decision. There's been tons of research that shows that the pain centers, the emotional pain centers in our brain, become very active when we spend money. The same emotional pain centers that become active when we lose our girlfriend or if our dog dies, it hurts us emotionally to spend money. So it's very natural for your prospects to want to postpone that decision. So here's what happens. As you're walking down the hallway, these other doors on the side are escape routes for your prospect. And when you get down to the end, they get the final piece of information about the money. They want to try to sneak out those doors and bring the sales process to a conclusion. Well, what do you suppose the words are that they use to get out of the hallway? You probably hear them every single day. I want to think about it, I need a cheaper price, and I need to get competitive bids. So next thing you know, you're at the end of the hallway, at least you think you are, and you're going to go through that last door and earn the business, but before you know it, your prospects sneak out of one of those side doors. Now, traditional sales techniques have taught us to go down that hallway, build a relationship and build rapport with our prospects, and then when they start raising objections, our job is to overcome them with rebuttals. Objections, rebuttals, objections, rebuttals. Next thing you know, it starts sounding like a tennis match, back and forth and back and forth. Think about this as well. When are tensions the highest on a sales call? In the beginning or in the end? Of course, in the end. The reality is when people get close to spending money, their tension level can raise. You can get nervous as well. So that seems like a very inopportune time to try to convince your prospects they don't need to think about it, or they don't need the cheapest price, or they don't need to talk to one of your competitors, because their tension level is very high. They're on DEFCON 1. They're super defensive at that point. So what I have learned through the consistency selling process is that the best way to approach this is to close those doors as we walk past them. In other words, I'm not going to wait for my customer and my prospective customer to bring up three bids or a cheap price or I want to think about it. I'm going to bring them up proactively. And as we walk past those doors, we're going to have honest, transparent conversations about these issues. And when they're satisfied that there's nothing to be afraid of, then I'm going to close those doors and we're going to move on down to the next objection. It's a little bit like when you have a situation with your kid and they wake up in the middle of the night and they're screaming because they think they see a monster in the closet. Of course, you know it's just a pile of laundry or something like that. But to your kid, when they wake up at midnight and they see the reflection of it in the streetlight, it scares them. So when your kid wakes up in the middle of the night and starts screaming, "Mommy, Daddy, there's a monster in the closet," when you go in to see what's going on, do you go in and start screaming at them, "Run, run, run," before it eats you? No, you try to calm your kid down. And what you do is you get her out of bed, you walk her over to the closet, you open the door all the way, and you turn the light on. As my papa used to say, you put a little light on the subject. And you show your kid that it's just a pile of laundry, nothing to be afraid of. When she's satisfied there's nothing there to be afraid of, you turn the light out, you close the door, and you put her back to bed. Well, folks, that's the same way you got to treat your prospects. Behind those doors are things they're afraid of. They're afraid of getting ripped off. They're afraid of making the wrong decision. Our job as sales professionals is to take them by the hand and walk over to the price door, open it all the way, turn the light on, and have an honest conversation about price. I mean, think about it. When does it ever make sense to buy the cheapest of anything? Usually it doesn't. Then, when the prospect is convinced there's nothing to be afraid of, we're going to turn the light off, we're going to close the door, take him by the hand, and walk him across the hall to the "I want to think about it" door. We're going to have a conversation about that. We're going to have conversations about competitive offers and competitive bids. The bottom line is we want to walk systematically down this hallway and answer all the questions, have honest, open, transparent conversations with our prospects, and then and only then, when we've closed all the doors, then we go in for the close. I'm always surprised how many times sales professionals try to run down the hallway, they leave all the doors wide open, and then they're surprised when they get a ton of objections at the end. The key is to prepare yourself to close by closing all the doors first, then you have an excellent opportunity to close the business. Now, the question remains, how do we close the doors? Well, this is where we're going to rely on the research by Dr. Robert Cialdini that we talked about in an earlier module. The bottom line is you have to remember that public declarations dictate future actions. In other words, we tend to take actions consistent with our words. Here's what you have to consider. Suppose you have a husband and wife that are your prospective customers. Before they start talking to you, the sales professional, what is the conversation they're having between themselves as they're driving to the car dealership, or as they're driving to the electronics store, or as they're driving to the furniture store? What conversation are they having? Well, it goes something like this. We're not buying tonight. We're going to think about it. We're going to get a cheap price, and we're going to shop at least 3 stores, right? So those, in many cases, are the last public declarations that they're having about this purchasing process. So if, as a sales professional, I never even address those issues, what actions are they going to take at the end of the sales presentation, at the end of the sales call? Well, they're going to take actions consistent with their previous declarations, which is to think about it, get the cheapest price, whatever it is. So our job as a sales professional is to have a different conversation with our prospects. We have to change their minds. The reality is, in sales, we often make the mistake that when we meet customers or prospective customers, that sometimes people are going to buy from us and sometimes they're not. And we're just kind of going on the sales call to find out which one of these situations it's going to be. Well, that's just not true. The reality is you can change people's minds. That's our job as sales professionals. So using Cialdini's research, we can use some very powerful tools to have a different conversation with our prospects. Think about this for a second. If I can get my prospects to make public declarations that price is not the most important consideration, that they don't need multiple bids, and that they don't need to think about it, then they become more likely to take actions consistent with that at the end of the presentation. The question is, how do I do that? Let me share a little research with you from Robert Cialdini that I think will illustrate exactly how we can use this research to become very successful in our sales careers. There was a company in Arizona, and their job was to raise money for childhood disabilities research. What they would do is send in canvassers in the neighborhoods. They would knock on the doors and ask people for donations. What they found over time is that approximately 18% of people would actually make a donation, a contribution. Well, they got Cialdini involved because they wanted to increase that rate of contribution. Cialdini comes up with the idea to have telemarketers call into those same neighborhoods the week before the canvassers go in. Now, the telemarketers do not ask for any money. They are simply taking a survey. But one of the survey questions is, do you think it's important to do childhood disabilities research? Now, if somebody calls your home and asks you that question, what are you going to say? Of course it's important. They're not asking you for money, they're just asking you if it's important. But they would get people to make these declarations. The next week, they would send in the canvassers, and what they found is that the rate of contribution doubled to 36% simply because people had made a public declaration that this research was important. Now, consciously, these homeowners were not thinking about that previous conversation, but subconsciously they know that they had made this public declaration, and now they feel obligated, in many cases, to take actions consistent with those words. Let me share another situation with you. There was a restaurant in Chicago, and as many of you may know, one of the biggest challenges for restaurants is that people will call and make reservations, and then they don't show up. The problem is they don't call and cancel those reservations, so the restaurant holds the table. Meanwhile, they can't give that table to anyone else. It kills cash flow, it kills capacity for restaurants. So restaurants are always trying to find ways for you and for me to get us to call back in if we're not going to make our reservations. So they studied their process in terms of how they book those reservations, and they changed 2 simple words that had a transformational impact on their no-call, no-shows. Instead of saying, please call if you can't make your reservation, they added 2 words, will you? Will you please call if you can't make your reservation? Then they were trained to pause and allow the customer to respond and say, yes, I will call if I can't make the reservation. Simply by getting people to make this simple public declaration that they would call, their no-call, no-show rate went down by 65%. It's an astounding level of success if you think about it. Now, I remember reading this research initially. I was in a bookstore reading it in a magazine where Cialdini had written this article, and I saw the implications on my sales career immediately. If I could get my prospects to say, price is not the most important factor. I don't need to think about it endlessly. I don't need to talk to one of your competitors. If I could get them to make those public declarations, what would the impact be on my sales career? Now, here's the thing. Will this work 10 out of 10 times? No, of course not. But here's the reality. Let's say you're a 40% converter right now, a 40% closing rate. That means out of every 10 opportunities, you're losing 6. The question is, will this technique, will this strategy work on 1 or 2 of the 6 that you're losing? I mean, listen, if you're getting 4 out of 10, you're not going to stop getting those 4. You're not going to forget how to get those 4. The real issue is we have to find a way to get 1 or 2 of the 6 we're losing. So what I've done in the course of this consistency selling program, I've developed 7 power questions that you're going to use to get those doors closed. You will systematically use the 7 power questions I've developed, and they're going to be detailed in an upcoming chapter to ensure your prospects make public declarations that are consistent with buying from you and not unnecessarily postponing the purchasing decision. This strategy will allow you to take your prospect's hand and walk them down the sales hallway. As you do, you'll engage in the 4 core activities. Number 1, relationship building. Number 2, you're going to investigate the problems. Number 3, you're going to sell your company and your solutions. And number 4, you're going to conclude the sales opportunity. You will have honest discussions about what's behind each door, every concern that your prospect has. And you're going to ask the appropriate power question to close the door and move on. Habits are hard to break and as hard as new ones are to create. But you should regard that as an advantage as you embark on this new journey. Here's an idea for you. I recommend dealing with objections before the prospect even brings them up. That's right. You may have been taught to never bring up an objection until the prospect does, but I completely disagree. Do you really believe that your prospects haven't thought about getting a cheaper price, even if they don't bring it up? You've got to proactively address these issues because you already know what they are. The bottom line is your prospects are more informed and more sophisticated than ever thanks to the internet. Waiting for the end of the sales process to deal with them will oftentimes be too late. It'll make you sound defensive and very old school. With a few simple exercises, questions, and what I call third-party verifiers, you can seal the doors shut. If a prospect tries to reopen the door at the end in an effort to escape the hallway, you can politely and respectfully remind them that the issue has already been addressed, and you'll remind them that they closed the door themselves. If you address price early on in the conversation, the prospect will be more inclined to agree with you about the dangers of a cheap price later on. Any issues that would come up at the end of the hallway have to be uncovered, discussed, and resolved as you walk down the hallway, not at the end when your prospect has adopted a defensive posture. If all the issues behind the doors have been addressed and the doors have been closed, you can hold your prospect accountable to what they previously agreed to. Remember, in many cases, your customers see a monster in those closets. Look at it this way. Often they see an issue they perceive as something to be afraid of behind one of the open doors. Maybe it's the price monster. Maybe it's the competitive bid monster. Your job is to take them by the hand and to walk them over to that closet, have those open discussions that we talked about, put a little light on the subject, and resolve it once and for all. Once you're convinced that your prospect understands there's nothing to be afraid of, turn off the light, close the door, and move on down the hallway. Here's the key. You're going to use not only the power questions, but third-party verifiers from an industry source that will support your contention that there's more to consider than just a cheap price. If you rush through the process to the end of the hallway, you'll be left empty-handed at the close, and only a hope and a prayer of the prospect calling you back. I'm all about positive thinking and hope, but try feeding your family with positive thinking. All we have to do is to build trust and get our prospects to commit to a story. Then we hold them accountable to their previous statements. You're going to get your prospects to commit to a story. I want you to write this down. Finding a reliable company who is competent and trustworthy is more important than multiple or competing bids. Price is not the most important consideration in the purchasing decision. And you're going to get them to make a definitive decision about you and your company that can be made without unnecessary delay. Then and only then do we ask for the order. For most consumers, spending money is painful, so they'll use open doors in the sales hallway as escape routes. Getting them to say that they prefer your company over getting 3 bids, that there are more important factors than just price, and that they can decide today are the consistency anchors that you will need to keep the doors shut. The way to do that is to be proactive about objections and leverage their tendency to act in a manner consistent with their public declaration.